Empire of Blood. Episode 14. War against the land itself. Thomas Robert Bugeaud and the annihilation of Algeria. There is no light inside the cave. Not darkness as an absence of light, the way a room is dark when the lamp is out. This is the dense, physical darkness of limestone, of a chamber deep enough in the mountain that no suggestion of the scurry reaches it, where your hand held 6 inches from your face is invisible. The families of the Ouled Raya tribe are packed into these chambers. Garfretas in the Dara mountains of northwestern Algeria, and they have been here for some time. Long enough for the children to have stopped crying from fear and started crying from hunger. Long enough for the air to have taken on the smell of too many bodies in an enclosed space. Long enough for the adults to have done the calculation and arrived, each of them at the same answer. We wait. We have waited before. The soldiers will move on. It is late June, 1845. The mountains are still cool at night, even in summer, and in the caves it is always cool, which is part of why the caves are useful, why generations of families have used them as refuges when the world outside became dangerous. The Dara Range runs east to west across northwestern Algeria, a corrugated landscape of limestone ridges and deep ravines and hidden valleys, the kind of terrain that has always belonged to the people who know it by foot, and not to the armies that try to move through it. The Ouled Raya know every path, every spring, every cave system in the mountains they were born in. This knowledge is their most important military asset. So it is the reason they have survived the French columns for years now, retreating before them, disappearing into the landscape, returning when the columns moved on. They came here because this is what you do when soldiers come. You take your children and your livestock, and you go into the caves and you seal yourselves in and you wait. The mountains are full of such chambers, deep, branching, cool even in summer. Their entrance is narrow enough to defend, their interiors complex enough to hold several hundred people with their animals. Generations of families have sheltered in these caves when raiders came, when drought threatened, when the world outside became unmanageable. The caves have always meant survival. Colonel Aimable Pellissier knows this. He has 800 soldiers with him. Marwin has been tracking the Ouled Raya for weeks. They have not been engaging him militarily. They have not been massing for battle or organizing guerrilla strikes. They have been moving away from him, deeper into the mountains, herding their animals, carrying what they can carry, trying to put distance between themselves and the columns of French soldiers that have been moving through their territory for years now, burning what they leave behind. When Pellissier's scouts locate the cave system, they identify at least several hundred people inside. Some accounts say 700. Some say more. Among them are women, children, old men, livestock, goats and sheep brought in because there is no other way to keep them from being seized. Pellissier sends a message into the cave. Surrender, come out. You will be treated as prisoners of war. Like there is no response, or the response is a refusal, or the response is simply silence. The accounts differ, and the difference matters to historians more than it mattered to Pellissier, who had already decided what he was going to do. He orders his men to seal the entrances. They pack the mouths of the cave with brushwood and thorn scrub, with everything flammable they can collect from the surrounding hillside. They work methodically, packing it tight, making sure the seal is complete. Then they light it. The smoke does not drift lazily into the cave the way campfire smoke drifts. It is forced in by the pressure of the burning material, pushed by the updraft into the chambers, filling them from the ceiling down. The people inside have nowhere to go. The chambers branch, but do not exit on the other side of the mountain. There is no back door. There is only the sealed entrance and the smoke coming through it, and the air that is being consumed by the fire and not replaced. What happens inside a sealed space when the air runs out is not the dramatic violence of battle. It is slow, it is systematic. Carbon monoxide builds before the oxygen depletes. The symptoms begin with headache and confusion. Then the limbs stop responding. Then the chest stops moving. Some of the people inside tried to dig at the limestone walls with their fingers. The evidence for this comes from the post-incident reports written by French officers who entered the cave afterward, because the accounts include descriptions of bodies found near the walls in positions consistent with attempted digging. They were trying to make a door where there was no door. The fire burns for hours. When Pellissier's men enter the cave the next day, they find somewhere between 700 and 1,000 bodies. The count is imprecise because the bodies cannot be easily separated in some of the chambers where the press of people was greatest. There are animals among the dead, goats, sheep, which makes the counting harder. One of the officers present, a man named Saint Arnaud, who will appear again later in this story in a very different capacity, writes a letter to his brother in which he describes the scene inside the cave with a precision that is more disturbing than anything he could have invented. He notes the smell. He notes the positions of the bodies. He notes the specific attitudes of those who died near the walls. He notes that among the dead are children. Pellissier himself is more systematic in his account. His official after-action report runs to several pages and describes the operation in the language of military administration, the number of troops deployed, the timeline of the operation, the tactical rationale for sealing the entrance rather than conducting an assault. He notes that an assault through a narrow cave entrance against an unknown number of defenders of unknown disposition would have produced significant French casualties. He notes that the people inside had been given the opportunity to surrender and had not taken it. He notes the military utility of the outcome. The area has been pacified. The resistance has been eliminated. The column can move on. Then Saint Arnaud writes something that is worth reading slowly. He writes to his brother, "I have done my duty as a leader, and tomorrow I will do it again, with no more remorse than today. My conscience does not bother me. His conscience does not bother him." Pellissier writes his own report. He is not apologetic. He is, if anything, clinical. He describes the operation as a military necessity, as the most effective means of dislodging an enemy force that had chosen to use the terrain against him. He uses the word enfumade, which means, roughly, smoking out, the same word used for clearing a beehive of its bees or a fox from its den. He is aware of the resonance of that language, uses it anyway. The people of the Ouled Raya are, in his report, an obstacle to be cleared. The report reaches Paris. The reaction is not what Pellissier expected, or rather, it is a more complicated reaction than a colonial officer in 1845 might have anticipated. And liberal politicians in the National Assembly read the report and stand up and speak about it. Newspapers print the story. There is debate. Genuine, documented, on-the-record debate in the legislature of the French Republic about whether what happened at Dara was a war crime, whether the phrase war crime yet existed for the thing being described, whether France, which had in living memory produced the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, could sanction the suffocation of 700 people in a mountain cave. The debate is lost by the people who object. Pellissier is not court-martialed. He is not censured. He is, in a few years, promoted. He will eventually become a Marshal of France and the Governor-General of Algeria. The cave at Dara is sealed. The dead are left inside. There is, for a very long time, no monument. And the man who made this possible, who created the doctrine, who built the system, who appointed the officers and wrote the orders and argued in Parliament and before the king that this was what conquest required, is Thomas Robert Bugeaud, Marshal of France. Governor-General of Algeria, peer of France, and the person we are going to spend the next 2 hours with. Remember that name. A nation in search of a wound to heal. France in 1830 is a country trying to remember what it used to be. The revolution is 40 years in the past. Napoleon is dead on St. Helena. The armies that had marched from Madrid to Moscow under the tricolor have been disbanded, their veterans scattered to quiet provinces, their generals reduced to writing memoirs in country houses. Waterloo is 15 years old and feels like yesterday. The Bourbon monarchy has been restored, then lurched into crisis, and is now on the edge of the convulsion that will produce yet another change of regime. France has not settled. It has not found the story it wants to tell about itself. Into this political environment comes Algeria. The pretext for the invasion is a diplomatic insult, a fly whisk. In 1827, the day of Algiers, Hussein struck the French consul with a fly whisk during a dispute about a long-standing debt. The debt was real. The insult was real in the code of honor that governed relations between European powers and North African rulers. The French government of Charles X, which was already deeply unpopular and looking for something that could recover its standing, decided that the insult required a military response. 3 years of diplomatic pressure produced nothing. And in June 1830, a French expeditionary force of 37,000 men landed on the Algerian coast. The Dey's army was defeated within 3 weeks. Algiers fell on July 5, 1830. The Dey surrendered on terms and was allowed to leave. Charles X announced the victory as a restoration of French national honor. A few weeks later, Charles X himself was overthrown in the July Revolution and replaced by the Orleanist monarchy of Louis-Philippe. The new government looked at the army sitting in Algiers and faced the question that would preoccupy French politics for the next 132 years. What do we do with this place? The answer they arrived at, slowly and by the accumulation of decisions rather than by any single grand strategy, was: we stay, we expand, we settle, we make this France. And the myth that moved and army empires do not sustain themselves through violence alone. Violence is expensive, exhausting, and politically complicated. What sustains empires over time is a set of stories. Stories that make the violence legible as something other than violence, that give the people doing it a way to understand what they are doing that does not require them to confront its full cost. France in Algeria ran on 4 stories, and understanding them is essential to understanding how the system that Bugeaud built was possible. The first story was the civilizing mission. France had a duty, a moral obligation, underwritten by the logic of Enlightenment universalism, of the rights of man, of the idea that France represented something more than a nation, but a principle, to bring civilization to less developed peoples. Algeria was, now in this story, a place of backwardness, of tribal violence, of arbitrary despotism that the French were going to rescue from itself. The story was self-congratulatory, in a way that made the people telling it impervious to irony. The methods used to bring civilization, the burning of villages, the destruction of food supplies, the suffocation of families in caves, did not register as contradictions within this story. They registered as necessary costs. The second story was racial hierarchy. The indigenous population of Algeria, Arab and Berber, Muslim, organized in complex networks of tribal affiliation and religious authority, was described in the language of 19th century European science as belonging to a lower order of civilization. This was not fringe opinion, so it was the consensus of the academic and political mainstream of the time, The journals published it. The generals cited it. The parliament debated Algerian policy on the assumption that it was true. Once you accept the premise that the people you are governing are constitutionally incapable of governing themselves, every act of domination becomes an act of care. The third story was agricultural destiny. Algeria, in the imagination of French planners and politicians, was a blank page waiting to be written on, a Mediterranean extension of French farmland, a place of extraordinary agricultural potential that was being wasted by its current inhabitants who lacked the scientific knowledge and work ethic to develop it properly. European settlers would come and transform the land. They would drain the swamps, irrigate the plains, plant vineyards and wheat fields, build roads and schools and cities. They would make the desert bloom. This story required, as its precondition, the removal of the people already living on the land. It required their displacement, their confinement, their reduction to a labor force rather than a population with territorial claims. The agricultural story was the economic engine of the colonial project, and like all economic engines, it ran on fuel that came from somewhere. The fourth story was military necessity. Frontier war was different from European war. The normal rules did not apply. The enemy did not fight in formations, did not hold fixed positions, did not respect the conventions of civilized warfare. To fight this kind of enemy, you had to become something different. You had to match the terrain, use irregular tactics, to strike at the foundations of the enemy's capacity, to resist rather than at his armies. This story was the justification for everything that could not be justified by the other three. It was the story that made the caves at Dara a military operation rather than a massacre. Abdal Khader and the resistance that would not break the French did not find an empty country or a passive population. They found a civilization with its own history, its own political structures, its own capacity for organized resistance. And in the years after the initial conquest of Algiers, they found a leader who was, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary figures of the 19th century. Abdal Khader ibn Muhyiddin was born in 1808 near Mascara, in western Algeria, into a family of Islamic scholars and mystics. His father, Muhyiddin, was the head of the Qadiriya Sufi order in the region, a position of spiritual authority and social influence that placed the family at the center of the religious and cultural life of western Algeria. Abdal Khader grew up in an environment of learning. Quranic study, Arabic literature, Islamic philosophy, the mystical traditions of Sufism that emphasized the direct experience of the divine over doctrinal formalism. He had also traveled on pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina as a young man, stopping in Egypt on the way, observing the modernizing reforms of Muhammad Ali, absorbing a wider picture of the Islamic world than most men of his background and generation would encounter. He was 24 years old when the tribal councils of western Algeria, looking for someone to lead organized resistance to the French, came to his father and asked. His father declined. He nominated his son. The son accepted, and in accepting began building something that was, in the context of Algerian history at that moment, genuinely new. A centralized state. The state Abdal Khader built had all the essential components. He organized a military force, light cavalry and infantry, disciplined, equipped partly with captured French weapons and partly with arms manufactured in his own workshops. He established a treasury, funded by taxation of the communities under his authority. He built an administrative system with provincial governors, caliphs, who reported to him and managed the civil affairs of their territories according to Islamic law. He opened negotiations with the French when he judged negotiation useful. and he was skillful enough in those negotiations to extract recognition of his authority over large portions of western Algeria in the Treaty of Tafna in 1837. He was also, by multiple accounts, including those of his French opponents, a man of considerable personal honor and moral seriousness. When French prisoners fell into his hands, he treated them according to the rules of war. He corresponded with French commanders with a formality and a precision that reflected genuine respect for the conventions of civilized conflict. He was, in other words, fighting by rules. The rules of Islamic just war theory, the rules of honorable conduct between recognized belligerents, that his French opponents were increasingly not. The Bugeaud doctrine, when it was fully implemented, was in significant part a response to Abdal Khader's strengths. Abd al-Khader's state was sustained by the loyalty and the agricultural output of the population it governed. The population moved when Abd al-Khader's military units moved, provided food and shelter and intelligence, maintained the administrative structures that made the state function. If you could break the population, not defeat it militarily, but simply make it unable to sustain itself, you could break Abd al-Khader without ever needing to defeat his army in a decisive battle. This was the insight that drove the Razzia doctrine, and it was an insight that emerged from a careful analysis of exactly what made Abd al-Khader's resistance durable: the making of a settler colony. The decision to stay in Algeria was not made cleanly. It accumulated through a series of smaller decisions, each one making the next harder to reverse. By 1835, there were 10,000 European settlers in Algeria. By 1840, there were 25,000. By 1850, there were 130,000. Each wave of settlers created a constituency for continuation. People who had sold their houses and farms in France and moved to Algeria, who had built homes and planted vineyards and were not going to accept the premise that they might have to leave. The settlers were the political anchor of the colonial project. They were the reason that every French government from 1830 onward found it impossible to seriously consider withdrawal. The settlers came from everywhere in Europe, not just France. There were Spanish, Italians, Maltese, Germans, Alsatians. France's immigration policy in the early colonial period was designed to attract anyone willing to work the land without too much attention to nationality. And the result was a colonial population that was, by the 1840s, genuinely heterogeneous, bonded not by shared French nationality, but by shared interest in the continuation of French colonial rule and shared anxiety about the indigenous majority around them. The Pieds Noirs, the settlers and their descendants, developed a distinctive colonial identity that was neither fully French nor anything else, that was defined above all by its relationship to the land they had occupied and the people they had displaced. The land was the point, always the land. The coastal plains of northern Algeria, the Mitidja, the plains around Oran, the valleys of the Seybous and the Chelif, were among the most naturally productive agricultural lands in the Mediterranean basin. Rich soil, adequate rainfall by North African standards, and a climate similar to the south of France or northern Italy. Before the French arrived, these lands were worked by indigenous communities under a complex system of collective and individual tenure that had sustained them for centuries. The French looked at this system and saw, or chose to see, waste, inefficient use of excellent land. The clearing of that land for European settlers required the clearing of the people on it, and Bugeaud was the man France found to do the clearing. The failure before Bugeaud, the French army that spent the 1830s trying to pacify Algeria, was not incompetent. It was applying the wrong doctrine to the wrong terrain against the wrong enemy. It had learned its tactics in the set-piece battles of the Napoleonic era. Battles where armies met in the open, where superiority in numbers and equipment and logistics determined outcomes, where the capture of cities and the defeat of organized armies ended campaigns. Abdal Khader did not fight that way. He fought the way the terrain demanded. The interior of Algeria is not flat. It is a country of mountains and plateaus and wadis and semi-arid plains that stretched for hundreds of miles, where a mobile force with local knowledge and a dispersed supply system could simply not be caught by a conventional army. The French columns that moved into the interior were heavy, slow, dependent on long supply lines, unable to pursue an enemy who melted away before them and reconstituted somewhere else. They could take ground. They could not hold it. They could win battles. They could not win the war. They also suffered from the climate. Algeria, in summer, is brutal. Temperatures in the interior reaching 45 degrees Celsius, water sources scarce, the terrain hostile to large formations moving on foot. French soldiers died of heat and thirst and dysentery in numbers that made the campaigns politically expensive at home. The official casualty lists from the early period of the Algeria campaign show more deaths from disease than from combat. An empire that is bleeding its army to disease in a country it cannot control is an empire looking for a new approach. The commanders who preceded Bugeaud were not monsters. They were, for the most part, professional soldiers trying to apply the methods they knew to a situation those methods were not designed for. General Bertrand Clausel, one of the early commanders, had attempted to establish a system of indigenous collaborators, men from the local elite who would administer their communities under French oversight. The system was undermined by the weakness of the French military presence and by the social dynamics of communities that had their own ideas about legitimate authority. General Vallet, who succeeded Clausel, tried a more aggressive conventional approach and took Constantine by siege in 1837, a genuine military achievement, but was no more able than his predecessors to pacify the countryside. What all of these commanders had in common was a reluctance, rooted partly in humanitarian scruple and partly in political calculation, to go as far as the situation, in Bugeaud's analysis, required. They burned some villages. They destroyed some crops. They did not do it systematically, comprehensively, as the primary method of the campaign rather than as an occasional instrument of reprisal. They were, in Bugeaud's view, half-measures, and half-measures in a war of this kind produced neither victory nor peace. They produced a long, grinding, expensive stalemate that killed French soldiers and Algerian civilians in roughly equal proportion without advancing the colonial project. Thomas Robert Bugeaud was France's answer to the stalemate. He arrived with a clear understanding of what the problem was and a brutal clarity about what solving it would require. He had none of the hesitation of the officers who had preceded him, men who had tried to reconcile the military requirements of colonial conquest with the political requirements of governing a civilian population. And Bugeaud had thought this through and arrived at a conclusion that was, in its own terrible way, coherent. In this kind of war, there is no civilian population. There is only the enemy and the territory that sustains the enemy. Both must be destroyed. He was the empire's answer to a question the empire had been afraid to ask out loud. The child of revolution and war. Thomas Robert Bugeaud de la Piconnerie was born on October 15, 1784, in Limoges, in the Limousin region of south-central France. He was the 15th child of an aristocratic family, a detail that tells you something about the world he was born into, a world before antibiotics and reliable contraception, where aristocratic households managed the problem of too many children by sending them into the church. the military, or advantageous marriages. Bugeaud was destined for the military. His childhood was shaped by two catastrophic events that arrived simultaneously: the French Revolution and the death of his mother, who died when he was 2 years old. His father, a count who had supported the Ancien Regime, was arrested during the Terror and spent time in prison. The family's estates were seized. Thomas grew up in poverty by the standards of his class, raised by an older sister on a reduced income, in a country that was still convulsing through the most violent political transformation in its history. The revolution killed the world his father had been born into and left no clear world in its place. What the revolution left, for a boy of his background, was a simplified moral landscape. The old hierarchies were gone. The church, the aristocracy, yet the comfortable certainties of the pre-revolutionary order. What remained was the army. The army was the one institution that the revolution had not destroyed. It had transformed it, purged its aristocratic officers, and replaced them with men who had risen by merit and energy and the willingness to fight. The Napoleonic army was, in theory, and to a significant degree in practice, a meritocracy. A peasant boy could become a marshal. An aristocratic boy without money could become a general. What you needed was competence, courage, and the willingness to keep moving forward when the man next to you fell. Bugeaud enlisted in 1804. He was 20 years old. Napoleon had just proclaimed himself emperor. The Grande Armée was the most formidable military force in the world, and it was in the process of demonstrating this across every corner of Europe. The Napoleonic formation, Bugeaud, fought in every major campaign of the Napoleonic period. Spain, Portugal, Austria. The campaigns of 1813 and 1814 that ended with Napoleon's first abdication. He was wounded multiple times. He was promoted for bravery. By the time Napoleon fell, Bugeaud was a seasoned officer with nearly a decade of continuous combat experience, an understanding of military logistics that had been tested against some of the hardest conditions in European military history, and a set of convictions about warfare that the Napoleonic campaigns had ground into him like stone. The lessons he took from Napoleon were not primarily about tactics. They were about method, about what war actually required at its most fundamental level. Napoleon had taught an entire generation of French officers that the key to victory was not the battle itself, but everything that preceded the battle: the logistics, the intelligence, the speed of movement, the ability to concentrate force at a decisive point before the enemy could respond. Napoleon was, above everything else, a manager of information and supply. He won not because he was brave, his officers were brave, but because he was better than his enemies at knowing where they were, moving faster than they expected, and hitting them where they were weakest. The Peninsular War in Spain, the campaigns against Spanish guerrillas from 1808 to 1814 that cost France more than any set-piece battle in the Napoleonic period, was particularly formative. Bugeaud served in Spain. He saw firsthand what a population-supported insurgency looked like in practice. The Spanish guerrillas had no fixed positions, no supply lines that could be cut, no cities that had to be defended. They melted into the landscape and hit French columns on the road, at river crossings, at night. They were sustained by the local population, who fed them and hid them and reported on the French movements. The French response was brutal, burning villages, executing suspected collaborators, destroying food supplies in areas of heavy guerrilla activity. The brutality was real and comprehensive and, in the end, insufficient. The guerrillas kept fighting. Bugeaud drew two conclusions from Spain. The first was correct. You could not defeat a population-supported insurgency with conventional military methods. and the second was catastrophic. The solution was to make the population unable to support anyone, not to win the population's loyalty, not to separate the insurgents from the civilians by political means, but to destroy the capacity of the civilian population to sustain resistance. Destroy the food, destroy the shelter, destroy the social infrastructure, make survival itself so difficult that resistance becomes an unaffordable luxury. The Peninsular War did not end with French success. Spain was eventually lost. But Bugeaud filed the tactical lesson without the strategic conclusion, and when he arrived in Algeria 20 years later, he applied the tactics with the conviction of a man who had been waiting for the right theater. The restoration and the making of a conservative. When Napoleon fell and the Bourbon monarchy was restored, Bugeaud's career entered its first significant pause. He retired to his family estates in the Périgord region of southwestern France, where he spent the years between 1815 and 1830 doing something that would matter enormously to his subsequent career: farming. This is not a detail to pass over quickly. Bugeaud was not a dilettante farmer. He was an experimental agriculturalist who read the scientific literature on soil chemistry and crop rotation, who tried new techniques on his own land and wrote about the results, who became genuinely expert in the relationship between land management and agricultural productivity. He corresponded with other agricultural reformers. He wrote pamphlets. He developed views about the land that were rooted in observation and practice rather than theory. His agricultural thinking fed directly into his colonial thinking in ways that seem almost logical once you see the connection. Bugeaud understood that productivity came from settled cultivation, from families rooted to specific plots, from the long-term investment of labor in soil improvement, from the stable social structures that supported continuous agricultural work. Nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples, in his analysis, were inherently less productive, inherently less capable of developing the land, inherently inferior as a matter of agricultural economics. This was the intellectual foundation of his approach to Algeria. The indigenous population were not simply enemies to be defeated. They were an inefficient land-use system to be replaced. He developed a concept he called colonization par la charrue et le fusil, colonization by the plow and the rifle. The phrase is elegant in the way that all elegant phrases about atrocity are elegant. It compresses a program of mass displacement into an image of agricultural progress. The plow represents civilization, productivity, the transformation of wilderness into farmland. The rifle represents the force necessary to clear the ground for the plow. In Bugeaud's thinking, these were not in tension, they were sequential. The rifle first, to remove the obstacle, then the plow, to build what the rifle had made possible. He said this in Parliament. He wrote it in his military dispatches. He used the exact phrase multiple times to describe his program. The agricultural metaphor ran through everything he said and wrote about Algeria. So he talked about weeds to be cleared. He talked about fallow land waiting to be cultivated. He talked about the transformation of the Algerian landscape in terms that an agronomist would use: yield per hectare, soil improvement, efficient use of water resources. And the indigenous people appear in this discourse as a variable in an equation about land use rather than as people with their own relationship to the land they lived on. Once you have accepted the framing, once Algeria is a problem of agricultural efficiency rather than a place where millions of people have lived for centuries, the methods Bugeaud proposed follow with a kind of grim inevitability. He entered politics in the 1820s, winning a seat in the Chamber of Deputies as a representative of the Périgord. He was a conservative, a supporter of the Bourbon monarchy. like a defender of the landed interest, a man whose politics was shaped by a deep distrust of the mobile, rootless urban masses that the revolution had briefly empowered and that Bugeaud believed represented the fundamental threat to French order. He had seen what uncontrolled popular violence looked like. He had grown up with it. He spent a significant portion of his political career arguing for the suppression of it. His political record in these years is revealing in ways that go beyond his colonial views. He was a consistent voice for order over liberty, for the authority of the state over the claims of the individual, for the idea that the management of populations, whether French peasants or Algerian tribes, required firm authority and clear hierarchy. He voted against press freedom. Then he supported the suppression of workers' organizations. He defended the use of military force against domestic civil unrest. He was not man of the extreme right in the French political context of his time. He was closer to the authoritarian center, the position that valued stability above all and was willing to use considerable force to maintain it. In 1834, he gave a speech in the chamber defending the government's decision to keep political prisoners in harsh conditions. The liberal opposition attacked him. The speech was not forgotten. In the same year, a young prisoner named Alibo was being held in connection with an attempted assassination of Louis Philippe, and there were protests in Paris about the conditions of his imprisonment. Bugeaud made a remark. The exact words are disputed by sources, but the substance is not, to the effect that he would use his umbrella against such protesters if they came to him. The remark became famous. He was nicknamed the Père Bugeaud after a popular satirical song. The nickname was not entirely affectionate. The First Algeria Command, learning the terrain. Bugeaud's first significant engagement with Algeria came in 1836, when he was sent to command a division there. He was 52 years old. He had not seen combat in 20 years. What he found in Algeria was an army that was physically and psychologically exhausted, fighting a war it did not know how to win, against an enemy who kept refusing to behave like a European army. He arrived with his agricultural mind and his Napoleonic training, and he looked at the terrain, and he looked at the enemy, and he drew conclusions. For the first conclusion was that the standard French military formation, the large column, heavily supplied, moving slowly along established routes, was a liability. It was slow, it was predictable, it could be watched and avoided, and it could not sustain itself in the field long enough to actually find and engage Abdal Khader's forces before they moved away. The column could take territory. It could not destroy an enemy. The second conclusion was about supply. Abdal Khader's forces were sustained by the agricultural output of the territory they moved through, by the grain stored in villages, by the livestock herded alongside the fighting men, by the wells and the water sources that the local population knew and the French columns did not. Destroy the food supply, Bugeaud concluded, and you destroy the army. And this was not a novel idea in military history. It goes back at least to the Assyrians, and was applied with devastating effect in the 30 Years' War and in Sherman's march through Georgia some 30 years later. But Bugeaud applied it with the systematic thoroughness of a man who had thought about the relationship between agriculture and power for most of his adult life. The third conclusion was about speed. Small, fast-moving columns without heavy supply trains, living off the land, able to change direction quickly and strike at multiple points simultaneously, could find and destroy Abdal Khader's forces where large columns could not. These were the razzias, fast cavalry and infantry raids designed not to hold ground, but to burn crops, seize livestock, destroy stored grain, and then terrorize the population into withdrawal from the areas the French needed to control. He tested these ideas in his first command. The Battle of the Sikak River in July 1836 was a conventional engagement that he won decisively, routing Abdal Khader's forces in a set-piece battle. The victory made him famous in France. It also convinced him that set-piece victories were essentially irrelevant to the larger problem, because Abdal Khader simply withdrew and reconstituted and continued the resistance. Winning battles was not winning the war. Winning the war required something different. The treaty he never believed. In 1837, the French government negotiated the Treaty of Tafna with Abdal Khader, and Bugeaud was the French signatory. He signed it and immediately began arguing against it. Not in private. In public, out in his parliamentary speeches, in his letters, in his military correspondence. He told anyone who would listen that the treaty was a mistake, that it would not hold, that Abdal Khader was using it to consolidate and rearm, that the only sustainable outcome in Algeria was total French control and total defeat of the resistance. He was politically astute enough to understand what he was doing by signing a treaty he publicly opposed. He was creating a record. When the treaty broke down, as it did in 1839 when Abdal Khader declared war after a French column passed through territory the treaty had assigned to him, Bugeaud could point to his own warnings. He had told them. He had signed under orders. Now let him do it properly. The collapse of the Treaty of Tafna was the moment that cleared Bugeaud's path to the governorship. The French government had tried the moderate approach, the negotiated settlement, the recognition of Abdal Khader's authority, the attempt to manage the situation rather than resolve it. It had not worked. France needed someone who was willing to resolve it. There was only one candidate who had thought through what resolution actually required. Governor General, the moment the man becomes the machine. Bugeaud was appointed Governor General of Algeria on December 29, 1840. He was 56 years old. He had the authority he had been seeking for 4 years. Unified command of the civil and military administration of Algeria, answerable in principle to Paris, but in practice operating with enormous autonomy, given the distances involved in the slowness of communication. He had the power to implement his doctrine. Now the only question was whether he would. He answered that question immediately. Within weeks of his arrival in Algeria, he issued orders that codified the approach he had been arguing for. Systematic destruction of the agricultural base supporting Abdal Khader's resistance. Villages that were known or suspected to be providing food, shelter, or intelligence to the resistance were to be burned. Crops were to be seized or destroyed. Livestock was to be taken. Water sources were to be located and controlled or contaminated. The population was to be driven off the land and into conditions in which survival, let alone military resistance, was impossible. He also reorganized the military structure. Out went the large, slow, supply-dependent columns. In came the flying columns, fast, lightly equipped, able to cover 30 or 40 kilometers a day, able to operate for weeks without resupply by living off what they seized. Each column was assigned a territory and a mission, not to hold it, but to make it uninhabitable for the enemy. The columns moved constantly, never staying in one place long enough to be targeted, never leaving anything useful behind them. The flying columns were a genuine military innovation, and Bugeaud was the right man to design them. His Napoleonic training had given him an intuitive understanding of the relationship between supply and mobility. His years of farming had given him an understanding of how rural economies actually worked, where the food was stored, how livestock was managed, what the agricultural calendar looked like, and when communities were most vulnerable. He knew that the right time to strike was after the harvest, when grain stores were full and could be seized or burned. He knew that destroying an olive grove was more damaging to a community's long-term survival than destroying a year's wheat crop. He brought an agronomist's knowledge to the task of engineered famine, and the combination was devastating. He explained himself with extraordinary candor. In his letters, in his parliamentary speeches, in conversations reported by contemporaries, Bugeaud was clear about what he was doing and why. He was not engaged in pacification. He was engaged in what he called la domination totale, total domination, the complete subjugation of the land and the people to French authority. He believed that anything less than total domination would simply restart the resistance the moment French military pressure relaxed. He had seen this happen. He had lived through the cycle of advance and withdrawal, of treaty and breakdown, of military victory followed by renewed insurgency. He was not willing to repeat it. He was the most self-aware architect of mass violence in this episode's history. He knew exactly what he was doing. He wrote it down. He is, in a sense, his own most damning witness. The philosophy stated plainly. In 1840, before his appointment as Governor-General but after his return from Algeria, Bugeaud gave a speech in the Chamber of Deputies that is worth dwelling on. He said, "I know that some philanthropists will cry out about the barbarism of our methods, but they should know that war cannot be waged without some cruelty. Those who engage in war must choose between two evils, a short, violent war, or a long, drawn-out one. I prefer the former. This is not the statement of a man who has lost control of a situation. This is the statement of a man making a reasoned argument about method. He's presenting the deliberate infliction of mass suffering as the humanitarian option, the choice that produces less total suffering than the alternative. This is the logic of the surgeon who argues that amputation is kinder than gangrene. It is a logic that has been used to justify atrocity in every century of recorded history, and it is most dangerous precisely when it is most coherent, because coherent arguments about the necessity of violence are harder to refute than incoherent ones. And the philanthropists he dismisses were not imaginary. They were real. Liberal politicians, some journalists, a handful of military officers who wrote about what they were seeing in Algeria with something like horror. The debate was happening. It was just happening while the burning continued. Bugeaud also wrote, in his military manuals and correspondence, about the specific relationship between agriculture and resistance. He argued that in a territory where the population was organized around pastoral and agricultural production, the destruction of that production was the most efficient path to submission. The people, he wrote, cannot fight if they cannot eat. The flocks are their treasury. The grain is their armory. Destroy the flocks, burn the grain, and the war is half won. He was right in the narrow military sense. So his methods worked in the narrow military sense. Abdal Khader surrendered in 1847, 6 years after Bugeaud took command. The French colonial state was established. The settlers came. The land was distributed. The extraction began. What Bugeaud did not account for, or did not care to account for, was what happened to the people whose flocks were destroyed and whose grain was burned. He thought of them as a variable in an equation. They were not variables. They were people, with children, with histories, with a specific and irreplaceable knowledge of how to live in a particular piece of land. When you destroy the agricultural system of a pastoral people, you do not merely interrupt their capacity for military resistance. You destroy their capacity to survive. And the famine that followed the razzias was not a side effect of the military campaign. It was the military campaign, the doctrine in practice. Bugeaud's doctrine had a name, la guerre totale, total war, not in the 20th century sense of industrialized slaughter, but in the sense of a war that recognized no boundary between the military and the civilian, between the combatant and the population that sustained the combatant. Every element of the enemy's capacity to resist was a legitimate military target, not just armies, not just fortifications, not just supply depots, crops, wells, livestock, villages, the labor that planted the crops, the knowledge that dug the wells, the social structures that organized the villages. All of it. The instrument of this doctrine was the razzia. The word is Arabic. It means raid, and the French adopted it wholesale, which is itself a small, ugly irony. They borrowed the word for destruction from the people they were destroying. A razzia was a fast military operation, typically lasting 3 to 5 days, conducted by a column of between 500 and 2,000 men, designed to sweep through a defined territory and remove everything of value from it. Livestock first. Herds of cattle and sheep and camels were seized and driven back to French supply depots or slaughtered on the spot if they could not be moved. Grain stores were next, burned if they could not be carried. Wells were identified and either controlled or fouled. Villages were burned. Orchards were cut down. The systematic destruction of orchards deserves a moment of attention, because it is one of the most revealing details of the campaign. An orchard takes years to establish. A fig tree or an olive tree requires a decade or more of care before it produces significant fruit. When you cut down an orchard, you're not merely removing this year's food supply. You're removing the next 20 years of food supply. You are destroying an investment of labor and time that cannot be quickly replaced. You are attacking the future of the people who planted those trees, who in many cases had inherited them from parents who had planted them, who had expected to pass them on to children. Bugeaud's columns cut down orchards systematically, because orchards were a fixed resource that sustained resistance and because destroying them sent a message that went beyond any individual battle. We are not just fighting you. Say we are making it impossible for you to remain here. The columns kept detailed records. Officers submitted written reports after each razzia that documented the number of animals seized, the quantity of grain destroyed, the number of villages burned, the estimated population displaced. These reports were reviewed by Bugeaud's staff, aggregated into operational assessments, and used to adjust the deployment of subsequent columns. The destruction was bureaucratized. It had its own paperwork. The paperwork is one of the reasons we know so much about what happened. The French colonial archive is not complete. Parts of it were deliberately withheld from scholars, parts were lost, parts were classified for decades after Algerian independence. But what survives is substantial, and it is damning in its specificity. The razzia reports read like agricultural inventories in reverse, not what was produced, but what was destroyed. 1,400 sheep seized from the Beni Mansour. 1,100 kilograms of grain burned in 3 villages of the Flissa. 17 wells identified and fouled in the Upper Chelif Valley. The language is administrative and neutral, and the cumulative effect of reading it is suffocating, because behind each line item are the people who planted the grain and tended the sheep and dug the wells, and are now facing a winter with nothing. The Bureau Arabe, the network of French administrators who managed indigenous affairs in the territories under French control, maintained detailed records of population movements, of community structures, of the material conditions of the indigenous Algerian population. These records document, hung with the unwitting precision of bureaucracy, the process of destruction. Communities that had sustained populations of several thousand in 1840 show populations of a few hundred in 1850. The notes in the margins of the administrative records use the language of natural disaster, famine, epidemic, dispersal. They do not use the language of cause and effect, because cause and effect would require the administrator to connect the destruction of the food supply to the deaths that followed. The officers who carried it out. A system of deliberate mass destruction requires men who are willing to carry out the orders, and the French officer corps in Algeria produced them in sufficient quantity. Some were enthusiastic, some were pragmatic. Some were disturbed by what they were doing and did it anyway because the alternative was insubordination, because the promotions went to the men who produced results, because the logic of the situation left little room for individual scruple. The career trajectories of the officers who served under Bugeaud in Algeria are one of the most telling indicators of how the system worked. The men who applied his methods most thoroughly were promoted most rapidly. Aimable Pélissier, who conducted the Dara cave suffocation, became a Marshal of France. Achille Barraguet-Dillier, whose columns conducted some of the most comprehensive razzias in the Western Territories, rose to high command. Thomas de MacMahon, who served in Algeria and absorbed its methods, eventually became President of France. The career incentives were perfectly aligned with the doctrinal requirements. Do the thing that wins, and the thing that wins is the thing that Bugeaud says wins. Count Robert, later a Marshal of France and one of the commanders in the Crimean War, served under Bugeaud and wrote letters home that described the razzias with something approaching ambivalence, noting the efficiency of the destruction and the effectiveness of the method without quite managing to express enthusiasm for it. He was the kind of officer who understood that his conscience was a luxury he could not afford in the current operational environment. He filed it away and kept moving. Randon, later also a marshal, was more straightforwardly committed to the doctrine, and he wrote explicitly about the destruction of food supplies as the primary mechanism of pacification and described the hunger of the civilian population as a desired military effect rather than an unfortunate side consequence. Saint-Arnaud, who was present at the Dara cave massacre and wrote so calmly to his brother about the absence of remorse, became Minister of War under Louis-Napoleon Bonaparte and was one of the key military figures in the coup of 1851 that transformed the Second Republic into the Second Empire. The man whose conscience was undisturbed by 700 deaths in a mountain cave went on to hold the second highest military office in France. This is the system working as designed. The enfumades, smoke as a weapon. The cave suffocations, the enfumades, did not begin at Dara. The tactic had been used before, though in smaller and less documented instances in the early years of the campaign. What Dara did was make the tactic visible, bring it into parliamentary debate, force the question of whether France officially sanctioned the suffocation of civilians as a method of war. The answer, as we have seen, was effectively yes. Not by direct endorsement. No French official ever stood up and said we approve of burning families in caves, but by the absence of meaningful consequence. Pélissier was not punished. The doctrine that made his decision logical was not revised. The incentive structure that rewarded results regardless of method was not changed. The system gave Pélissier permission through its silence. There was a second major enfumade the same year, 1845. Colonel de Montagnac conducted a similar operation against the Sbaya tribe in a different location. The death toll is less documented than Dara, but appears to have been in the hundreds. Montagnac's account of the operation is, if anything, more direct than Pélissier's. He describes it as a necessary and effective method and expresses no apparent conflict about it. De Montagnac was killed shortly afterward in the Battle of Sidi Brahim, which made him a military martyr in France and complicated any posthumous reckoning with what he had done. The enfumades are the sharpest and most visceral expression of Bugeaud's doctrine, and they are important not because they are the worst thing that happened in Algeria. They are not, in terms of total deaths, the worst thing, but because of what they reveal about the logic of the system. The cave is a specific spatial metaphor for the entire colonial project. The people inside are people who have retreated to what they believed was safety, who have done the thing that survival experience told them to do, who have used the knowledge of the terrain that was their greatest asset. And the response of the colonial army is to take that asset and make it a death trap. The place of refuge becomes the place of death. The act of trying to survive becomes the occasion for being killed. This is what total war means. In practice, there is no safe behavior, no position of withdrawal, no act of non-resistance that the system will honor. There is only submission or death, and the system is designed to make the boundary between those options as thin as possible. Famine is policy. The razzias did not just destroy food. They destroyed the systems that produced food, and the distinction is critical, because systems are harder to rebuild than stocks. The agricultural communities of western and central Algeria in the 1840s were organized around a complex balance of sedentary farming and pastoral movement. Different communities held rights to different seasonal pastures, moved their animals along established routes between highland summer grazing and lowland winter pasture, coordinated their movements with the agricultural cycle of planting and harvest. This system had been developed over centuries, was encoded in the collective memory and the legal structures of the communities, and was, in the context of the semi-arid environment of the Algerian interior, highly efficient at extracting food from land that would have supported much less under European agricultural methods. The razzias destroyed this system at multiple points simultaneously. The seizure of livestock removed the animals that formed the basis of the pastoral economy and provided the fertilizer for the agricultural one. The destruction of grain stores removed the reserves that communities maintained for bad years, the insurance against drought that the system required to be sustainable. The burning of villages destroyed the social infrastructure around which the production system was organized. The displacement of populations separated people from the specific local knowledge of water sources, of soil conditions, out of seasonal variations that made effective land use possible. The result was famine. Not immediately, and not in a single catastrophic event that could be clearly dated and documented. Rather a slow, distributed, grinding collapse of the productive capacity of the indigenous population spread over years, affecting different communities at different times, producing deaths that were recorded in French administrative documents, when they were recorded at all, as deaths from disease or natural causes rather than as deaths from the deliberate destruction of the means of survival. Estimates of the total indigenous population of Algeria at the time of the French invasion in 1830 range between 3 and 5 million people. By 1872, 40 years after the invasion, or 25 years after Abdal Khader's surrender, the indigenous population had fallen to approximately 2.3 million. The causes are multiple and cannot be cleanly separated. Direct military violence, disease, famine from the destruction of the agricultural system, reduced birth rates under conditions of extreme stress, displacement, and its consequences. What can be said with confidence is that the population of Algeria declined by somewhere between a third and a half during the first 4 decades of French rule, and that the policies Bugeaud designed were a primary contributor to that decline. The parliamentary opposition and why it failed. The opposition to Bugeaud's methods was real, documented, and entirely ineffective. it is worth understanding why it failed, because the failure is instructive about how systems of mass violence sustain themselves against moral objection. In the Chamber of Deputies, liberal politicians, including Alexis de Tocqueville, yes, the same Tocqueville who wrote Democracy in America, who is celebrated as one of the great theorists of liberal democracy, did visit Algeria and write about it. His conclusions are disturbing in their complexity. Tocqueville was critical of some aspects of the military campaign. He described the destruction of villages and food supplies as morally troubling and potentially counterproductive. He wrote in a letter to a friend after visiting Algeria that he had seen things there that would disturb the sleep of a man of conscience. And then he concluded in a series of notes and parliamentary reports written between 1837 and 1847, that total conquest was nonetheless the correct policy, that France could not afford to withdraw, that the colonization of Algeria was a necessity for French national greatness. He managed, through the sheer acrobatic capacity of a brilliant mind, faced with a morally intolerable situation, to simultaneously criticize the methods and endorse the goal. He wrote that France should not take pride in the way it was conducting the war, and then he wrote that the war must be conducted to its conclusion. He wrote that the destruction of indigenous society was a tragedy, and then he wrote that a strong and permanent French Algeria required it. He was the most sophisticated voice for what was, at its core, the same position as Bugeaud's. The end justified the means. The means were regrettable, and the end was non-negotiable. Tocqueville is a useful figure here precisely because of his sophistication, because he is not a crude racist or a simple apologist for violence. He is a man who had thought more carefully about liberty and democracy than almost anyone alive in his time, and who still could not see the Algerians clearly enough to place them within the circle of people whose liberty mattered. The limitation was not a personal failing. It was a structural feature of the moral imagination of his civilization, which had drawn the circle of full humanity in a particular way and was not yet capable of redrawing it. The debate about the enfumades in 1845 was genuine. Politicians stood up and read Pellissier's report into the record and demanded answers. The most sustained attack came from a deputy named Lamoriciere's opponent, and from journalists who had received copies of the reports through unofficial channels. The government gave them answers. The operation was militarily necessary. The victims had refused to surrender. The alternative would have been prolonged casualties among French soldiers. The Minister of War defended Pellissier carefully, not enthusiastically, using the language of military necessity with the precision of a man who knows that enthusiastic defense would be worse than measured defense. The debate lasted several days and produced no consequence. The structural reason for this failure is not complicated. The people being killed were not French citizens. They had no votes, no representation, no political constituency within the system that was debating their fate. Say the people who had material interests in the outcome of the debate, the settlers receiving land grants, the merchants supplying the army, the officers building careers, the politicians whose electoral coalitions included all of these people. All had interests aligned with the continuation of the colonial project. The people who objected were motivated by principle. Principle rarely defeats interest in legislative chambers when the interests are sufficiently concentrated and the principles are sufficiently abstract. There is also the distance problem. Algeria's was across the Mediterranean. The fires and the suffocations and the famines happened there among people whose language most French citizens did not speak, in a landscape most of them had never seen, in the name of a project whose benefits, land for settlers, national prestige, the possibility of agricultural wealth, were described in concrete and vivid terms, while the costs were described in administrative language, in the measured prose of after-action reports, in numbers that were insufficient to convey the lives they represented. The soldier's experience. What was it like to be a French soldier carrying out the razzias? The personal accounts are scattered and partial, but they are not entirely absent. French soldiers wrote letters home. Some kept diaries. Some, in later years, wrote memoirs. The picture that emerges from these personal accounts is more complicated than the official record suggests. Not because the soldiers were morally tormented by what they were doing, but because the experience of conducting systematic destruction produces its own particular psychological texture, different from the experience of conventional battle. Conventional battle is intense and brief. There is an enemy in front of you who is trying to kill you, and you are trying to kill him, and the situation resolves, one way or another, relatively quickly. The razzia was different. The razzia was work. You rose before dawn, you marched in the heat, you arrived at a village, and you burned it. The inhabitants had fled in most cases. They had learned to watch for approaching columns and move their people and animals before the soldiers arrived. In other cases, the inhabitants were still there. Old people who could not move quickly, women who had not received the warning in time, children, sick people. You burned the village anyway because the orders were to burn the village. So if these people happened to be inside the village when you burned it, that was their problem. Several French soldier accounts describe what might be called the habituation process, the way in which acts that initially produced discomfort gradually became routine. A soldier who had been unsettled by his first experience of burning a village describes, in later letters, performing the same action without reflection. Not because he had resolved his discomfort through some process of moral reasoning, but because the discomfort had simply worn away under the pressure of repetition and the social environment of a military unit whose norms treated the burning of villages as normal work. This is not a unique psychological phenomenon. It is the mechanism by which ordinary people participate in systematic violence, not through a single act of moral decision, but through the gradual erosion of the inhibitions that prevented them from participating in the first place. The French military also had a specific institutional culture that shaped the experience of its soldiers in Algeria. The Armée d'Afrique, the name given to the French forces stationed in Algeria, developed its own identity over the decades of the campaign, distinct from the metropolitan French army. It was a professional force, hardened by continuous combat, shaped by the specific demands of the Algerian terrain, and proud of its toughness in a way that made humanitarian scruple look like weakness. The officers who expressed reservations about razzia tactics risked being perceived as soft, as men who didn't understand the real conditions of the war, who were importing civilian sensibilities into a military environment where such sensibilities were a liability. The institutional culture of the Armée d'Afrique was in this sense a machine for suppressing exactly the kind of individual moral resistance that might otherwise have slowed the implementation of Bugeaud's doctrine. Abdal Khader's surrender. Abdal Khader surrendered on December the 23rd, 1847. He had been fighting for 15 years. He had built a state, organized a resistance, defeated or stalemated French forces repeatedly, and outlasted 2 French governors and a dozen French commanders. In the end, Bugeaud's doctrine broke him, not in any single battle, but through the accumulated destruction of the material base that sustained his movement. The communities that had fed and sheltered his fighters were starved out. The agricultural system was wrecked. There was no longer enough food, enough shelter, enough support for a continuing war. He surrendered on conditions he was to be given safe conduct to a Muslim country of his choice. The French promptly violated the conditions and imprisoned him in France, at the Château d'Amboise, where he spent 5 years. He was eventually released by Louis Napoleon, went to Damascus, and spent the remainder of his life in exile, dying in 1883. In Damascus, in 1860, when a sectarian massacre targeted the Christian community, Abdal Khader used his personal influence and the loyalty of his followers to protect thousands of Christians from the violence, an act of principled humanity that earned him the Legion of Honor from Napoleon III, awarded by the same nation that had broken its promises to him, imprisoned him, and destroyed his country. He is remembered in Algeria as the Emir, the founder of the Algerian nation, the first and greatest of the independence leaders. His image is on Algerian currency. His name is on the largest mosque in Algiers. The French, who defeated him by destroying the country he was defending, gave his name to a city in California that an explorer named after him. The histories of the powerful and the histories of the defeated rarely agree on what matters. Abdal Khader understood something that Bugeaud never did, that you can break a people's capacity to fight without breaking their will. That surrender is not the same as submission. That history takes notes. The numbers begin, as always, with the numbers, imperfect as they are. The indigenous population of Algeria at the time of the French invasion in 1830 is estimated at between 3 and 5 million people. Demographers working from the first systematic French census of 1872 found a population of approximately 2.3 million indigenous Algerians. The decline, somewhere between 500,000 and 1.5 million people, depending on the baseline estimate, was the result of 4 decades of military violence, engineered famine, epidemic disease operating in a population weakened by malnutrition and displacement, and the disruption of the agricultural systems that had sustained the pre-colonial population. The deaths are distributed across time and cause in ways that make any single figure approximate. The scale is not approximate. The famine years of the late 1860s, which killed an estimated 300,000 Algerian Muslims in the single span from 1866 to 1870, came after Bugeaud's active tenure and were the result of a combination of drought and the still unreconstructed agricultural system that his campaigns had shattered 2 decades earlier. You do not have to be holding the match to have started the fire. The direct violence is harder to count, because the French military records from the campaign period are incomplete, because many deaths from razzia operations were recorded as displacement rather than death, and because the colonial archive was managed by people with interests in how its contents were read. The most careful modern historical estimates suggest that between 500,000 and 1 million people died in Algeria during the first 3 decades of French conquest from the combination of military violence, famine, and epidemic disease that Bugeaud's methods produced. Some estimates are higher. The range is wide enough to be uncomfortable and narrow enough to be damning. Land tells its own story. Before 1830, the indigenous population of Algeria held their agricultural land through a combination of tribal collective ownership, religious endowment, and individual tenure. Within a generation of the French conquest, the most productive agricultural land in the coastal plains and the major river valleys had been transferred to European settler ownership through a series of legal mechanisms that ranged from outright confiscation to the manipulation of indigenous communities' inability to navigate French property law. By 1870, European settlers held the majority of the prime agricultural land in Algeria. The indigenous population had been pushed into the less productive interior, onto hillside plots and semi-arid plains that could support subsistence agriculture in good years and could not support it in bad ones. The named and the voiceless history gives us the names of the perpetrators and the commanders and the administrators, and it gives us, with terrible asymmetry, almost none of the names of the people who died. This is not an accident. The colonial archive was built by the colonizers and reflects their interests. The reports, written after the cave suffocations at Dara, do not contain the names of the people inside the cave. They contain estimates. They contain tactical assessments. They contain the names of the French officers present. We know that among the dead at Dara were women and children because the French officers who entered the cave afterward noted this in their reports, not as an admission of atrocity, but as a factual observation. We know that people attempted to dig through the limestone walls because the evidence was visible afterward. We know that the families of the Ouled Raya tribe who were not in the cave when it was sealed came back afterward and found what was left. We do not know their names, the names of those who died, or the names of those who survived and had to continue living in a territory that had just killed their families. The Ouled Raya and the Spea tribes, the primary victims of the 1845 cave suffocations, continued to exist. They were not exterminated, but they were broken in the specific sense that the word captures the destruction of a community's capacity to maintain its structure and its continuity. Families were scattered. The social networks that organized production and reproduction and the transmission of knowledge were disrupted. The people who survived carried their grief and their dispossession into a French colonial system that offered no acknowledgement of either. Bugeaud himself died in 1849, 2 years after Abdal Khader's surrender, of cholera contracted during an epidemic in Paris. He was 64 years old. Now, he died a Marshal of France, the holder of the highest military honor his country could confer, celebrated in the official histories as the man who pacified Algeria. His funeral was attended by the military and political establishment of France. Streets were named after him. A statue was erected. The system he had built continued without him, and the land he had cleared continued to receive settlers, and the people he had broken continued to die in the ways that people die when the systems that sustained them have been systematically destroyed. The 132-year wound French colonial rule in Algeria lasted from 1830 to 1962. 132 years. The structures that Bugeaud built in the 1840s, the legal architecture of land expropriation, the military administrative system, and the racialized social hierarchy that placed European settlers above indigenous Algerians in every domain of civil life, were not temporary measures of conquest. They became permanent features of the colonial state. They were elaborated, codified, refined, and extended over 5 generations. The Code de l'Indigénat, the legal code governing indigenous Algerians under French rule, denied them the rights of French citizenship while subjecting them to French sovereignty. They could be imprisoned without trial for offenses that would not be offenses if committed by European settlers. They could not travel freely within the country. They could not assemble politically. They could be conscripted for labor. They had, in the formal structure of the law, a different and lesser humanity than the people who ruled them. But this was not informal discrimination. It was statute. It was the law. The Algerian War of Independence, which lasted from 1954 to 1962, was the consequence of this structure working exactly as designed. You cannot remove a population from its land, deny it political representation, subject it to racialized legal disability for 5 generations, and expect the result to be acquiescence. The FLN, the Front de Libération Nationale, which led the independence movement, was born of the same soil that Bugeaud had tried to destroy. The knowledge that the land had been taken, the memory of what had been there before, the accumulated grievance of 132 years. The war began on November 1st, 1954, with coordinated attacks on French military and civilian targets across Algeria. And the French government's initial response was to deny that what was happening was a war at all. Prime Minister Pierre Mendès France declared that Algeria was France and that no partition was possible or conceivable. This was the official position for years. That the violence was criminal insurgency rather than a war of national liberation. That the legal and political framework of French Algeria was legitimate. That the people fighting to end it were terrorists rather than patriots. The methods the French army used in the Algerian War of Independence were direct descendants of the methods Bugeaud had developed a century earlier. The internment camps, in which the French military imprisoned vast numbers of Algerian civilians under conditions of systematic hardship, were a modern version of the displacement policy. The systematic use of torture, particularly by the 10th Paratroop Division under General Jacques Massu during the Battle of Algiers in 1957, was documented in real time, debated in the French press and parliament, and continued anyway. The structural pattern was identical to 1845. The evidence of atrocity was visible, the debate was genuine, and the system rewarded the men conducting the atrocity with promotions and political support. The Algerian War of Independence was, by any measure, a catastrophe for both countries, though incomparably more so for Algeria. The French army conducted a systematic campaign of torture against FLN suspects and sympathizers. Torture that was publicly documented, that produced the same pattern of insufficient consequence that the Daha debate had produced a century before. Tant the OAS, the Organisation de l'Armée Secrète, a settler-backed terrorist organization that conducted bombings and assassinations against Algerian civilians and French officials who supported independence, was the direct descendant of the settler interest that Bugeaud had created the conditions for. When Algeria finally achieved independence in 1962, between 500,000 and 1.5 million Algerians had died in the 8-year war. The European settlers, more than 1 million people, fled to France in a mass exodus that produced social and political reverberations in French society that are still felt today. How France remembers. France has been arguing about Algeria for 160 years, and the argument has not concluded. This is not a sign of the argument's intractability, so much as a sign of its centrality. And Algeria is not a peripheral episode in French history. It is a structural feature of what France became in the 19th and 20th centuries. The wealth generated by colonial extraction funded French industrialization. The political conflicts generated by colonialism shaped French domestic politics. The settlers who fled Algeria in 1962, the Pièces Noires, became a significant political constituency whose grievances and nostalgia have shaped French right-wing politics from de Gaulle to the present. Algeria is inside France. For most of the 20th century, the official memory of Bugeaud in France was heroic. He was the man who built French Algeria. He was a Marshal of France, the highest military honor. Streets and squares and military installations bore his name. To the statue that was erected to him in Algiers, a bronze figure on a pedestal in the center of the colonial city, stood until Algerian independence in 1962, when it was removed. The reckoning came slowly, unevenly, and incompletely. In 1999, the French Parliament officially acknowledged for the first time that the conflict of 1954 to 1962 was a war rather than a police action, a symbolic change that had been resisted for 40 years. In 2005, a law was passed requiring French schools to teach the positive aspects of colonialism, a law so widely condemned by historians and educators that it was eventually abrogated. In 2017, Emmanuel Macron, then a candidate for the presidency, he described French colonialism in Algeria as a crime against humanity and was attacked so fiercely for the remark that he partially walked it back after taking office. The Bugeaud question specifically has been addressed in the specific and revealing way that France tends to address these things. Slowly, locally, incompletely. The street in Paris named after him, the Rue Bugeaud in the 16th arrondissement, still exists as of the time of this recording. There have been proposals to rename it. There has been resistance to renaming it. The argument continues, and the street sign stays up while the argument continues, which means that the default position, in the absence of resolution, is the one that honors the marshal. The arguments for keeping the street name are themselves revealing, and they follow a consistent template. We cannot erase history. Renaming streets is a form of censorship. We should teach about Bugeaud in context rather than pretending he never existed. His military service to France extends beyond his colonial record. These are not arguments about whether what Bugeaud did was acceptable. They are arguments about whether what a country does with its public spaces says anything about what that country values. The people making them are aware, generally, of what Bugeaud's doctrine produced. They have simply concluded that the country's relationship to that history does not require the removal of his name from a street in the 16th arrondissement. In Algeria, there is no ambiguity about how Bugeaud is remembered. He is a symbol of colonial violence and nothing else. His name does not appear on streets or squares. The French Algeria he built is a wound that Algeria's post-independence history has been organized around healing. Not always successfully, not always coherently, but persistently and with the intensity of a country that has had to build a national identity on top of an interrupted one. The memory of what was done is part of the political air that Algerians breathe, the context in which every negotiation about the relationship between France and Algeria takes place. What remains unresolved? In 2020 and 2021, a movement to reckon with colonial statues and street names swept through France as it swept through much of the Western world. In Bordeaux, a statue of a slave trader was targeted. In Paris, the debate about colonial monuments intensified. In Algeria, the Algerian government issued formal demands that France acknowledge the crimes of the colonial period and pay reparations. France has not done so. The official position of the French state remains that colonialism was a complex historical phenomenon with both negative and positive aspects, a framing that historians have described as historically inaccurate and morally evasive. The specific memory of the enfumades, the cave suffocations, has had an unusual trajectory. For most of the colonial period, they were simply not discussed in France. They were in the historical record, buried in the military archives, accessible to scholars, but not part of the public narrative of French Algeria. The liberal politicians who had debated Pellissier's report in 1845 were themselves forgotten. The debate was forgotten. The caves were sealed, and the dead were inside them, and the grass grew back over the hillside. In the second half of the 20th century, as the Algerian War of Independence made the history of French colonialism impossible to ignore, the enfumades resurfaced, first in Algerian national memory, then in French historical scholarship, then slowly, haltingly, in French public consciousness. The scholar Benjamin Storer, who has spent his career documenting the history of French Algeria, has described the enfumades as one of the founding atrocities of colonial Algeria and one of the most important pieces of evidence for understanding the trajectory that led from Bugeaud's governorship to the Independence War a century later. The logic that made the caves at Dara possible, Storer argues, is the same logic that made the torture centers of the Algerian War possible. The methods changed. The logic did not. The scholar Benjamin Storer, who has spent his career documenting the history of French Algeria and who is perhaps the most important living historian of the Algerian War, has described the Enfumades as one of the founding atrocities of colonial Algeria and one of the most important pieces of evidence for understanding the trajectory that led from Bugeaud's governorship to the Independence War a century later. The logic that made the caves at Dara possible, Storer argues, is the same logic that made the torture centers of the Algerian War possible. The specific methods changed. The institutional culture that produced them, the culture that placed military effectiveness above moral restraint, as that defined the indigenous population as an obstacle rather than as people, that created career incentives for the men willing to go furthest, persisted across a century of colonial rule with remarkable consistency. Storer was appointed in 2020 to co-lead a commission on the memory of colonialism and the Algerian War, charged with proposing measures of reconciliation between France and Algeria. The commission was jointly commissioned by Emmanuel Macron and Algerian President Tebboune, a sign in itself that something was shifting, that the official diplomatic relationship between the two countries had reached a point where direct engagement with the history was becoming a political necessity rather than a political risk. The Commission's report, published in 2021, was careful and substantive and politically limited in equal measure. And it recommended the opening of archives, the creation of joint memorial commissions, educational reforms in both countries. It described the colonial system as characterized by deep injustice and structural violence. It stopped well short of the formal apology that Algeria has consistently demanded and that French governments have consistently refused to offer. The gap between what the report described and what the governments agreed to do with that description is, in a sense, the defining gap of the Franco-Algerian relationship. Everyone agrees that what happened was bad. The question of what follows from that agreement, who owes what to whom, what acknowledgement looks like in practice, and what reparations might mean in the context of a 132-year colonial relationship, is a question that neither country's political class has been willing to answer with the specificity the history requires. The smoke from those caves is still in the air. What Bugeaud tells us, the temptation at the end of an episode like this, is to reach for a conclusion, a clean, moral statement that tells us what to do with the history we have just spent 2 hours with. The temptation is to say, here is what this means, here is the lesson, here is what distinguishes the past from us. Thomas Robert Bugeaud does not yield to this temptation easily because he was not a monster in the sense of being incomprehensible. And he was a man of considerable intelligence and genuine conviction who had thought carefully about the problem he was assigned to solve and arrived at a solution that was, in the military terms of his time and context, effective. He was not disobeying orders. He was not operating outside the system. He was the system's most articulate and self-aware exponent. He wrote down what he was doing and why. He argued for it in Parliament. He was consistent, coherent, and largely correct in his tactical assessments. And he produced, as the direct consequence of his methods, the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, and the destruction of the civilization that had inhabited one of the most beautiful and complex landscapes in the Mediterranean world. He believed in the civilizing mission with something approaching genuine conviction, and he believed that France was doing something good in Algeria. that the disruption and the violence were the price of bringing order and progress and rational agriculture to a territory that had been, in his assessment, wasted by its current inhabitants. He was not performing this belief. He was not using it as a cover for what he knew to be simple extraction. He actually believed it. The terrible efficiency of his methods was in the service of a goal he considered noble. This is what makes Bugeaud so instructive and so difficult to dismiss as simply evil. The civilizing mission was the consensus worldview of the most educated and progressive segments of French society. Liberals believed in it. Republicans believed in it. The men who had read Rousseau and Voltaire, and who thought of themselves as the inheritors of the Enlightenment, believed in it. The belief was not a marginal position held by crude racists. It was mainstream, sophisticated, philosophically elaborated, and it was used to justify a system of destruction that killed hundreds of thousands of people and dispossessed millions more. The pattern should be recognizable. It is the same pattern we have seen in every episode of this series. The specific content of the justifying ideology changes. Divine right, racial science, civilizing mission, the vanguard of the proletariat, the war on terror. The structure of the justification is identical. We are doing a good thing. The people being harmed are less fully human than we are. The costs are regrettable but necessary. And those who object are naive or sentimental, or do not understand the stakes. The structure of the justification is a machine that runs on the dehumanization of the target population and produces atrocity as reliably as any factory process. And the structure is not unique to the past. That is the part that is always hardest to sit with. The conditions that made Bugeaud possible, the colonial incentive structure, the racial hierarchy embedded in legal frameworks, the distance between the people making decisions and the people bearing the consequences of those decisions, the career rewards for men who produce results without asking questions about methods. Those conditions have not been abolished. They have been modified. They take different forms in different contexts. But the structure persists. Aim in the willingness to identify a population as outside the circle of full humanity and to construct a justifying ideology that makes their destruction legible as progress persists with it. The colonial project in Algeria also raises a specific and uncomfortable question about the relationship between liberal political philosophy and colonial violence. France was not, in the 1840s, a country without a tradition of thinking about liberty and human rights. It was the country that had produced the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. It was the country that had given the world Montesquieu and Voltaire and Rousseau. It had, in the memory of living people, produced a revolution explicitly justified by the idea that all men were created with equal natural rights. And yet, from the same civilization that had produced the Declaration of the Rights of Man was perfectly capable of producing Bugeaud and Pélissier and the cave at Dahra and the enfumade that killed 700 people in a mountain in Algeria. Not despite the tradition of Enlightenment universalism, but in some complex and terrible way because of it. The civilizing mission was not a cynical cover story invented by men who privately knew they were engaged in simple extraction. It was a sincere belief held by educated men who had read Locke and Montesquieu and who believed they were acting on principle. The Enlightenment tradition contains, embedded in its insistence on universal human reason, a very specific set of assumptions about what rationality looks like. What kinds of social organization are rational? What kinds of land use are rational? What kinds of religious practice are compatible with reason, and which are superstition? And when a civilization armed with that tradition encounters people who organize their lives differently, the tradition can produce, has produced, The conclusion that those people need to be educated out of their ways, and that the education may require force. This is not a claim that the Enlightenment caused colonial violence. The causes of colonial violence are material and economic and political, and the ideas came after the interests, as they usually do. But the ideas mattered in the way that rationalizations always matter. They made it possible for intelligent, educated, thoughtful men to participate in systematic atrocity without experiencing themselves as participants in systematic atrocity. And they gave the violence a vocabulary that made it feel like progress. There is a building in Algiers that was once the headquarters of the French colonial administration. It is still there. It has other uses now, and in the Dara Mountains of northwestern Algeria. There is a hillside above the Shelif River Valley where the cave system of Gar Freitas opens in the limestone. The entrance is small, not much taller than a person. The cave is deep and branching, with chambers that widen as you move inside. The light from the entrance fades within a few meters, and beyond that there is the dense, physical darkness of limestone that admits no sky. In 1845, a French colonial officer sealed that entrance with brushwood and lit it on fire, and somewhere between 700 and 1,000 people died in the dark. The cave is not empty of them, and it was sealed. The decision was made not to excavate and remove and bury them elsewhere, and so the dead of the Ould Raya tribe remained where they died, inside the mountain that had been their refuge and became their tomb. The French colonial administration maintained the seal for the entire 132 years of the occupation. When Algeria achieved independence, the new government built a monument at the site, a marble structure with an inscription in Arabic commemorating the martyrs of the Fumades. The inscription does not contain individual names because the names were never recorded. The monument commemorates an unnamed multitude. There is a grass now on the hillside. There are birds. The mountain looks like a mountain. But the entrance is still there, and the cave is still there, and the people who died in it are still there, and the question of what to do with that, how a country that calls itself the country of liberty and the rights of man should understand its relationship to a sealed cave in the Dara Mountains containing the bodies of the people it killed, is still there too. The smoke, if you know where to look, never fully cleared.